Oops. Well, hi, folks. Welcome to our second lecture for the evolution of plants. Our first lecture focused on non-vascular and seedless plants, plants that lacked seeds. And so now we're going to talk about the two major groups of seed plants and some of the things that are kind of important and associated with them. So as you see, I've opened up the week 13. I didn't realize that it wasn't already open, so I apologize for that. But we'll take that into account as we continue to go through our lecture topics. Remember that I'm only going to do 2 lectures per week, and then I'll probably give you another activity. The next activity that we're going to be doing is it's going to be another TED Talk that's appropriate about a plant topic. And you guys are going to have a worksheet that you can fill out as you watch the TED Talk. And then there'll be a quiz that you can then fill in the blanks from your worksheet on that quiz. And then I can have that graded for you. So, all right. Now let's talk a little bit about seed plants. These are going to be some of the plants that you guys are most familiar with. And so these are what we would consider the most derived, meaning that they are the most changed over evolutionary time, right? So they're at the tip of our tree here when we look at the evolution of the plant lineages in general. Okay. Now, the first time that we see seed plants in the fossil record is about 305 to 465 million years ago. And so that's a long time, right? These seed plants all evolved from what we call spore-bearing plants. So all the plants up until we get to the seed plant, their reproductive structure was a spore. Okay, they weren't a true seed. And so now we're going to get to this more derived group, the seed plants, because they have this specific adaptation, a seed, right? Now the seed is really important adaptation because it's going to protect and also provide food for the embryo. And we're going to look at a little bit of that differences there as we look at some of the different types of seed plants. Okay. Now the cool thing about a seed is that it allows the plant to remain dormant, and basically it's stationary and not in a growth phase. And so that basically can allow those seed plants to survive very harsh conditions like a winter, for example, or a drought. Okay, so sometimes seeds can be remaining dormant for years to come, all right? In some of our seed plants, the flowering plants, for example, we have some fruits that are also developed, and this is going to encourage what we call dispersal, or the movement of that seed and embryo to a new location. Okay, you know, some plants, they produce different kinds of fruits. You know, we can think of an apple, and you think about that nice, sweet, fleshy portion of the apple, and then the seeds are protected on the inside of that. Well, the whole point is that somebody will eat that and then take the seeds elsewhere and deposit them in a nutritive environment, right? When it comes out the back end of some organism. Okay. All right, now the other sort of key evolutionary transition when we're thinking about our seed plants is the gametophyte, and specifically the male gametophyte. Okay, for plants, for seed plants, our male gametophyte is pollen. Okay, that's equivalent to like the sperm in an animal. Right, so no longer, once we get to these seed plants, we don't need water. The sperm don't have to be flagellated, which they've been for most of these other seed plants. Now we have something that can be dispersed by wind, okay, by other organisms, right? So we're not dependent on water any longer for the dispersal of the sperm from our seed plants. Now let's look at a little bit closer in depth to our seeds. So just a little bit of information about seeds. Don't worry too much about that. But the main part here is that you have a developing embryo, and this is an example of a eudicot seed. Okay, so a good example would be like a kidney bean. Okay, so inside the seed, we have the developing embryo, and you have these 2 first leaves, okay, and then a first root. And in addition to the embryo that's inside of the seed, we also have this nutrition source, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then finally, we have a seed coat. So there's this protective layer that hardens and surrounds the seed, protecting it from any external conditions. All right, now, as I said before, the male gametophyte, or the gamete portion of the plant, is pollen for males. And for females, it's called the ovule. So that's the unfertilized egg cell in a plant. Okay, now if we look at these two kinds of gametophytes, remember as we were looking at our evolution of plants in general, you know, you start out with the mosses that are gametophyte dominant, meaning that's the thing you see. And then we move to sporophyte dominant as we continue to get more derived from the ancestral version of our plants. Okay, so most of the time, the male gametophyte is dispersed by, like I said, wind or another organism called a pollinator. Now the female, usually the female gametophyte is always going to be enclosed in the sporophyte generation of the plant. And we're going to look at an example of that when we look at the structure of a flower a little bit later in this lecture. So just kind of to give you an idea of what are some of the current day phyla in our seed plants, we have a larger group within the gymnosperms, and we're going to talk specifically about them. The Coniferophyta, Cycadophyta, Gnetophyta, the G is silent, and Ginkgophyta. And then finally, our really large group of angiosperms or Anthophyta, the flowering plants. So let's first talk about gymnosperms. These guys have what we call naked seeds. They don't really have a nutritive source attached to that seed. Okay, and there's 4 living groups, as I just said: the conifers, cycads, Cnetum, or the cnidophytes, and ginkgos. Okay, no flowers, no fruit in the gymnosperms, so keep that in mind. Also, when we think about these are species that tend to produce a cone, and so it might be a little bit easier for you to kind of think about this, because when you have a cone, each of those cones has individual scales on it, and that ovule, that egg cell, is going to be on each scale. Okay. Now, if we look at, this is an example of a gymnosperm where you can see, so male and female pine cones are separate on the conifers or whatever gymnosperm we're talking about. And males, usually they're developing right now. And so they're producing a lot of pollen right now. Some of you might be allergic to that. And then the female cones are the ones that we see, you know, dropped on the ground and things later. The male cones really will just dry out or desiccate over time. And so they just will like flake off of the branches. Okay, so if you get to go for a walk, just check out those pine branches, right? These are just a few microscopic images that we can see on the inside of the cone, you know, where that egg shell, or the egg would be found, or the individual pollen grains on the male cones. Okay, so most of the gymnosperms have both male and female cones that are separate. Now you guys are probably most familiar with the conifers. Okay, we've got coastal redwoods in the Pacific Northwest. These are the tallest living vascular plants, huge. And maybe you've even seen some of those images where they've got like a Volkswagen Beetle on the, you know, that drives right through one of those trees where they've got a little arch cut into it. Okay. Then we also have some of the oldest living species of trees on the planet called the bristlecone pine. Okay, that's one of the oldest trees. Some of those are about 500 years old. We often see the conifers in colder climates and higher elevations. They're well adapted to more of a drier climate. Okay, if you think about, most of them are needle type leaves, okay, which reduces water loss. And then we use conifers for a lot. Okay. For building products, lumber, right? Making paper, resin, and even an anti-cancer pharmaceutical drug called Taxol. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of species of pines, all in the northern hemisphere. Like I said before, they produce these very tough needle-like clusters of leaves. Okay? They have a very thick waxy coating or cuticle on those individual leaves. Their stomata are like indented and really deep into that needle, so it can basically prevent or minimize water loss from the plant. And then the leaves also have specialized canals where resin can be excreted, and the resin is actually shown to have an antifungal effect, so it can deter fungal infection of trees, and also insect deterrent. Okay. Now, we're going to watch a short video on pine reproduction here, and I'm going to switch out here and go to this. So we're going to look at seed reproduction in pines. So here we go.
A pine is a common conifer found all over the northern hemisphere. It can be used as a model for the seed production process in all gymnosperms. The adult sporophyte, the pine tree, develops male and female cones on separate branches. Female cones develop two ovules on the upper surface of each cone scale. Each ovule contains haploid megaspores. Male cones produce microspores by meiosis. The microspores develop into pollen grains. Each winged pollen grain is a four-celled male gametophyte. The female gametophyte grows, producing two or more archegonia, each of which contains an egg. During pollination, a wind-borne pollen grain falls near the opening in one of the ovules of the female cone. Each male gametophyte forms a pollen tube that penetrates the tissue of the female gametophyte. When the pollen tube has grown into the archegonium, a sperm cell from the male gametophyte fertilizes the egg. The zygote develops into an embryo and a mature seed is produced. The female cone opens, releasing the seeds. When conditions are favorable, the seed germinates into a new, young sporophyte, a pine tree seedling.
Okay, let me pause that. All right, we're going to go back to our lecture here. Now, another major group of gymnosperms, in addition to the pines, are the cycads, and these are more of a tropical species. Probably the only cycad species that is in, at least the continental United States are found mostly in Florida, and that's there's a Floridian cycad. But these guys are typically slow growing. The really kind of interesting thing is that they do look like palm trees, but their leaf-like structures are much stiffer and have a thicker waxy coating on them. Some of the larger cycads, so they can get up to 9 or 10 feet tall, but they can have these massive female cones on them. And the interesting thing about a cycad is that the cones on a cycad actually grow right out of the base of the plant itself, so not on the individual leaves. The other sort of interesting component about cycads is that they have the largest sperm cells of all organisms. So, just in case you needed that for your trivia night, okay? These guys have the largest sperm cells of all organisms. Many of the cycads also are fertilized by beetles, okay, which is also sort of interesting because many of the gymnosperms are wind-pollinated sperm. So kind of interesting, right? All right, now we have this other group of sort of, I would call it a conglomeration of some of the weirder plants within the gymnosperms. These are the cnidophytes, and we've got a couple different representative members here. So we have ephedra, and if you've heard of the pharmaceutical ephedrine, it's often used as a decongestant. And then by the not so good production, it is a major ingredient in the production of meth, okay, methamphetamines. So that's not a good thing. So don't do that. All right. And then we also have this group called cnidum. And these guys are very strange because they look like they have angiosperm leaves. So it's not what you would necessarily expect for a gymnosperm. And then finally, we have these desert adaptive plants called welwitschia. And in fact, this big sort of wig-like structure of the welwitschia, it started out as two individual giant leaves that got frayed in the wind, and that's why it kind of looks like a wig-like structure. Okay. Now, these are the only gymnosperms that have vessels within their xylem tissue. Because remember, now we're looking at the vascular plants, so we've got xylem and phloem for these guys. And they have these weird members, and so we're going to watch a short video about the welwitschia. All right, here's our welwitschia. So welwitschia is the most unusual plant in the world. It's a gymnosperm, like cycads and pines, a bizarre living fossil. This plant has only 2 leaves, which slowly grow nonstop. Welwitschia is thought to live for up to 2,000 years. There's nothing else like it on Earth. One of my favorites. Now, I didn't make this video, obviously.
200 miles to the west of the Kalahari lies an even hotter, drier desert, the Namib. Very few plants indeed can survive in these parched sands. Patches of grass sprouted after a rare shower of rain and lived for a few weeks, but that was over 4 years ago, and now only the dusty, withered stems are left. There is one plant that grows here, though, and indeed nowhere else, and one that is very odd indeed. The scientist who first described this extraordinary plant was an Austrian called Dr. Velvich, who came to this part of Africa in the middle of the last century. He discovered many plants in Africa, but this perhaps is his most famous, and the one that bears his name, being called Welwitschia. There are male plants and female plants. This one is a female, and these are the female structures. These are young ones which sprouted this year, and these are the fully developed ones from last year. In structure, they're very like the cones of a fir tree. The male plant has growths rather like stamens which produce pollen. So Welwitschia seems to be a kind of link between coniferous trees and true flowering plants. But the oddest thing about it, perhaps, are its leaves. They grow from the top of its central trunk. And what's more, do so extremely slowly, so that this length of leaf would have taken about 70 years to be produced. But if it hadn't frayed at the edges, it would be about 400 yards long, because this individual plant is thought to be about 1,500 years old. It's these amazing leaves that enable the plant to collect water in this rainless country. The Namib lies close to the western coast of Africa. At dawn, fogs regularly roll in from the Atlantic. As they swirl around the Welwitschia, their moisture condenses on the plant's huge leaves. Some droplets are absorbed through cracks in the leaves' skin. The rest of the water is channeled down to the ground, where it's sucked up by roots just below the surface of the sand.
All right. So I think it's kind of cool to see some of the video footage of some of these really strange and weird gymnosperm species, you know, especially the ones that we're not so used to seeing. All right, let's continue on here. And now that we're going to talk about the last phylum, the ginkgophytes or Ginkgophida. Now, ginkgos have male and female trees, okay? And we see most of the gymnosperms in general, not all, the conifers tend to have male and female parts on the same tree, okay? Whereas the cycads, the Needham and the Welwitschia, those plants have separate male and female plants. And whenever you have separate male and female plants reproductive structures on different plants, we call those plants dioecious. And the ginkgos are a great example of that. Now, ginkgos also retain some of these ancestral traits, like they've got flagellated sperm. This is actually the cone of a ginkgo, okay? It looks more like a berry, right? So this is a female tree because the cones are only going to grow on the female. And then the other interesting thing about these leaves, and we actually have multiple ginkgos on campus, so later this spring we'll see some nice ginkgo leaves on campus, but they've got parallel venation, and it's a dichotomous branching. So you basically have all these veins that branch out, okay, from a central point, right, on these individual leaves. So kind of an interesting group. All right, I'm gonna stop our lecture right here, and then I'm going to do a separate shorter lecture on the angiosperms, just so you have kind of two shorter lectures for this major topic that we're discussing today. So I'm gonna go ahead and close this one and chat with you again soon.